The preacher arrived at 4 in the morning. Grace Hartley heard his horse before she saw him, hooves on frozen ground, the jangle of a bridle, then boots on the porch steps of her uncle's house. She was already dressed, had been dressed since midnight when her uncle told her what dawn would bring. The preacher knocked once. Her uncle opened the door. Cold air rushed in, carrying the smell of snow and pine, and the kind of darkness that comes before the sun remembers how to rise. "It is time," her uncle said. Grace stood. She wore her mother's wedding dress, the only decent dress she owned, altered twice to fit a body her mother had never carried. The hem dragged on the floor. The waist had been let out with mismatched thread. Her uncle looked at her the way he had looked at her since her parents died, like she was a burden he had carried too long and was finally setting down. They walked outside. A man waited beside a horse, tall, silent. His face was mostly shadow under his hat, but Grace could see the scars. They ran down the left side of his face from temple to jaw, thick, raised, the kind that came from fire or blade or something worse. He did not speak. He did not nod. He simply stood there like a man waiting for something he had already accepted. If you have ever stood at dawn watching the last door close behind you, drop the name of your city in the comments. I want to know how far fear travels before it turns into something else. Subscribe if you believe the things we are most afraid of sometimes hold the things we need most. Because what Grace found in that locked room in the mountains of Wyoming in the winter of 1883 changed everything she thought she knew about silence and scars and men who cannot speak. Grace's parents had died of typhoid 6 months earlier. She had been 18. Her only living relative was her Uncle August, her father's older brother, who ran a timber operation 40 miles north of Laramie and had a wife who looked at Grace like she was competition for air. August had made it clear from the day Grace arrived she could stay 6 months. After that, she needed to be married or working somewhere else. He was not supporting her forever. Grace had tried to find work. She had asked at every house in town, every shop, every farm within riding distance. The answer was always the same. No work, no room. No need for another mouth to feed in a territory where winter lasted 8 months and money lasted half that long. 2 weeks ago, August had come to her with a solution. A man in the mountains needed a wife. His name was Silas Kane. He was 35. He owned land. He had a house. He had money. He had one problem. He could not speak. An accident 7 years ago had crushed his throat. He could breathe. He could eat, but he could not make sound. "He needs someone to keep house," August said. "Cook, clean, the usual. He will provide for you. You will provide for him. It is a fair trade." "Does he want to marry me?" Grace asked. August shrugged. "He needs a wife. You need a husband. Want does not enter into it." Grace had asked to meet him first. August said no. Silas lived 2 days' ride into the mountains. He came to town once a season. He would not come for a meeting. It was marriage or nothing. Grace chose marriage, because nothing meant the street, and the street in a Wyoming winter meant death. The preacher performed the ceremony on the porch. 15 minutes, no music. No witnesses except August and his wife, who stood with her arms crossed, and her mouth set in a line that meant good riddance. The preacher asked Grace if she took this man. She said yes. He asked Silas. Silas nodded. The preacher pronounced them married. August handed Silas a bag of Grace's belongings, 2 dresses, a coat, a Bible, a hairbrush, and a tin cup her mother had given her. Silas took it. He tied it to his saddle. Then he held out his hand to help Grace mount the horse. She took his hand. It was rough, scarred, warm. He lifted her onto the horse like she weighed nothing. Then he mounted behind her, and they rode north into the mountains as the sun finally broke over the hills behind them. They rode for 2 days. Silas stopped 3 times to let the horse rest and to give Grace water and dried meat from his saddlebag. He did not try to speak. He pointed when he needed her to understand something. This way, drink this, stay close. His gestures were clear, efficient. He had learned to communicate without sound, and he did it well. They stopped the first night at a line shack, a tiny cabin used by shepherds in summer. Silas built a fire. He cooked beans and cornbread in a cast-iron pan. He gave Grace the only blanket and slept on the floor by the door. In the morning, he made coffee so strong it tasted like dirt and leather. Grace drank it anyway. She was too cold to care. They reached his house on the second afternoon. It sat in a clearing surrounded by pines, with a creek running behind it and mountains rising on three sides. The house was stone and timber, larger than Grace expected, well built. Smoke rose from the chimney. Someone had been there recently, keeping fires lit. Silas dismounted and helped Grace down. He carried her bag to the porch. Then he opened the door and stepped aside. She walked in. The house was warm, clean. The main room had a stone fireplace, a table, 4 chairs, a rocking chair, shelves lined with books. A kitchen area with a stove and a pump. 2 doors on the far wall, one open showing a bedroom, one closed with a lock on the outside. Grace stared at the locked door. Silas saw her looking. He crossed the room and stood in front of it. He shook his head once. Definite, clear. Do not open this door. Grace nodded. She understood. Some doors were meant to stay closed. Silas showed her the rest of the house. The bedroom would be hers. He would sleep in the loft above the main room. There was a root cellar stocked with potatoes, carrots, turnips, dried beans, salted meat. There was a chicken coop behind the house, a barn with 2 cows and the horse, a smokehouse, a well. Everything needed to survive a winter that would lock them in this clearing for 4 months. That first night, Grace cooked supper. Venison stew, biscuits, coffee. Silas ate without looking at her. When he finished, he stood and washed his own plate at the pump. Then he climbed the ladder to the loft and disappeared. Grace sat at the table alone, listening to the fire crack and pop and the wind press against the walls. She went to bed in a room that smelled like cedar and loneliness. She lay in the dark, wondering what she had agreed to. A marriage to a man who could not speak, a house in the mountains with a locked door, a winter that would trap them together with nothing but silence between them. The days developed a rhythm. Grace woke before dawn and made breakfast. Silas came down from the loft and ate. Then he went outside to work, chopping wood, tending animals, mending fences, clearing snow. Grace cleaned. She cooked. She mended his clothes. She read books from his shelves, novels and poetry and natural history. Whoever had lived here before had loved to read. Silas came in for lunch, then went back out until dark. At supper, they sat across from each other at the table and ate without speaking. After, Grace washed dishes while Silas carved small figures from wood by the fire. Animals mostly, birds and deer and horses, each one detailed and careful. He left them on the mantel. Grace did not ask why he made them. He would not have been able to answer. 2 weeks passed, then 3. Grace grew used to the silence. She grew used to the way Silas moved through the house, like he was afraid of taking up too much space. She grew used to the locked door that he never opened and never explained. But she thought about it. Every time she passed it, she wondered what was inside. Why it needed a lock. Why Silas had stood in front of it that first day like he was guarding something precious or dangerous, or both. In the 4th week, Grace woke in the middle of the night to a sound. Not wind, not animals, something else. She got out of bed and opened her door. The main room was dark except for dying embers in the fireplace. She heard it again. A low sound, muffled, coming from the loft. She climbed the ladder. Silas was asleep on a narrow bed pushed against the far wall. He was dreaming. His body jerked. His hands clenched the blanket. The sound came again, not a voice, but something close to it. A broken, strangled sound that came from a throat that could not shape words. Grace knelt beside the bed. She did not know what to do. She reached out and touched his shoulder. "Silas!" He woke, gasped, sat up so fast he almost hit her. He stared at her in the dark. His breathing was ragged. She could see fear in his eyes. "You were dreaming," she said softly. "You are safe." He turned away, put his head in his hands. His shoulders shook. Grace sat beside him. She did not touch him. She just sat there. After a long time, his breathing steadied. He looked at her. Then he reached under his pillow and pulled out a piece of paper. He handed it to her. She took it to the fireplace and stirred the coals until they gave enough light to read. The paper was old, worn. The ink faded, but she could make out the words. My dearest Silas, I know you blame yourself. I know you think you should have saved us. But what happened was not your fault. The fire was not your fault. You did everything you could. Please do not lock yourself away. Please do not stop living because we are gone. We loved you. That has not changed. Let someone else love you too. Let yourself be happy again. Your loving wife. Catherine Grace read it twice. Then she looked up at the loft where Silas had lain back down facing the wall. She folded the paper carefully and climbed the ladder. She set it on the small table beside his bed. I am sorry, she said quietly. I am sorry you lost them. He did not move, but she saw his hand reach out and touch the paper. She climbed back down and went to bed. In the morning, Silas was gone before she woke. She made breakfast and waited. He did not come in for it. She wrapped the food and left it on the table. At noon, she saw him outside by the barn. He looked like he had not slept. She brought him the breakfast she had saved and a cup of hot coffee. He took it without looking at her. She went back inside. That afternoon, she heard the door to the locked room open. She was in the kitchen kneading bread. She turned. Silas stood in the doorway of the locked room. He looked at her. Then he stepped aside. An invitation. Grace wiped the flour from her hands. She crossed the main room and stopped at the threshold. Silas moved back to let her see. The room was small. A cradle sat against one wall, hand-carved, beautiful, lined with a quilt stitched in blue and yellow. A rocking chair sat beside it. On the walls were shelves holding small clothes, tiny shoes, wooden toys. A woman's shawl hung on a peg. A pair of knitting needles rested in a basket with half-finished baby blanket. Grace stepped inside. She touched the cradle. It rocked gently. She looked at Silas. His eyes were wet. She understood. This was not just Catherine's room. This was the baby's room. The child they had lost in the fire. How long ago? She asked. Silas held up 7 fingers. 7 years, he nodded. And you have kept this room locked all that time? He nodded again. Grace looked around the room, at the life that had been planned and lost, at the hope that had burned away, at the grief that Silas had locked behind a door because looking at it hurt too much. Why did you show me now? She asked. Silas pulled a small notebook from his pocket. He wrote something and handed it to her. You asked why I was afraid. This is why. I lost them. I am afraid I will lose you too. Grace's chest tightened. She looked at this man who had been forced to marry a woman he did not know, because he could not find anyone willing to live with someone who could not speak. This man who had lost his wife and child and had spent 7 years alone in the mountains because grief was safer than risk. I am not going anywhere, she said. Silas wrote again. You did not choose this. You had no choice. I know, but I am choosing to stay now. This is not where I thought I would be, but I am here, and you are not what I expected. But that does not mean I want to leave. Silas stared at her. Then he wrote one more sentence. Why would you stay with someone who cannot even speak to you? Grace thought about it. About the last month. About the way Silas moved through the house with care. About the way he made sure she had enough food and enough firewood. About the way he carved small animals by the fire and left them for her to find like gifts he could not say out loud. About the nightmare that had broken him open enough to show her the letter. About this room he had just unlocked. Because you speak in other ways, she said. You speak with your hands when you carve. You speak with your actions when you make sure I am warm and fed. You speak with your eyes when you look at this room and I can see everything you lost. She paused. You are not silent, Silas. You are just quiet. And I am learning to hear you. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he crossed the room and took her hand. He held it gently, carefully, like he was afraid it might break. Then he led her back to the main room and closed the locked door behind them. But he did not lock it. After that day, things changed. Silas started eating breakfast with her instead of taking it outside. He sat by the fire in the evenings while she read aloud from the books on his shelves, novels and poetry, and stories about places neither of them had been. He listened. Sometimes he smiled. Once, when she read something funny, he laughed, a strange, rough sound that came from his chest instead of his throat. It surprised both of them. He started teaching her his work, how to split wood properly, how to milk the cows, how to tap the sugar maples when spring came. He was patient. When she made mistakes, he showed her again without frustration. She started learning his gestures, the tilt of his head that meant yes, the shake that meant no, the way he touched his chest that meant thank you, the way he touched his forehead that meant he was tired, the way he looked at her when he wanted to say something but could not find a way to show it. In February, a storm trapped them inside for 5 days. Snow piled against the door 3 feet high. The wind howled. The cold was brutal. They spent the days by the fire. Grace read, Silas carved. On the 3rd day, Grace set down her book. "Tell me about Catherine," she said. Silas looked up. He set down his carving. He pulled out his notebook. "What do you want to know? How did you meet?" He wrote for several minutes. Then he handed her the notebook. "Her father owned the general store in Laramie. I came in for supplies. She was working the counter. She smiled at me and I forgot what I came to buy. I went back every week for 3 months before I finally asked her father if I could court her. He said yes. We were married a year later. She was the kindest person I ever knew. She made me better." "What happened the night of the fire?" Silas's hand shook as he wrote. "I was working in the barn, late, fixing a broken stall. I smelled smoke, ran to the house. It was already burning. Catherine was inside. She was 8 months pregnant. I broke through the door, found her in the bedroom. She was unconscious. The smoke was too thick. I carried her out, but she was not breathing. I tried to get her to breathe. I tried everything, but she was gone. The baby too. I went back in to see if there was anything I could save. A beam fell, crushed my throat, destroyed my voice. I woke up 3 days later in a doctor's office. They told me Catherine and the baby were buried. They told me I would never speak again. I wished I had died in that fire too." Grace's eyes filled. She reached across and took his hand. "But you did not die. You survived, and you built this house, and you kept going," Silas wrote with his free hand. "I kept going because I did not know how to stop, but I was not living. I was just existing, until you came. I have not done anything. You are here. That is enough." That night, Grace lay in bed and thought about what Silas had written, about a man who had lost everything and spent 7 years locked in grief as surely as he had locked that room. About a marriage that had started at dawn with no choice and no love and nothing but necessity. She thought about leaving. When spring came, she could ask Silas to take her back to Laramie. She could find work. She could start over. But she did not want to. She wanted to stay in this house with this man who carved her small wooden birds and made sure she had enough blankets and listened when she read, even though he could not tell her what he thought. She wanted to stay because somewhere in the silence and the snow and the routine, she had started to care about him. More than care. In March, the snow began to melt. The creek ran high and fast. The chickens started laying again. Green shoots appeared in the garden. Silas opened the locked room and took out the cradle. He carried it outside and set it under a tree. Grace watched from the window. That night, he wrote in his notebook and handed it to her. "I am ready to let them go. Not forget, but let go. I think Catherine would want that." "I think so too," Grace said. Silas wrote again. "I need to tell you something. I did not marry you because I needed a cook or a housekeeper. I married you because I was tired of being alone. I was tired of living in a house with a locked door and a grief I could not escape. I thought maybe if someone else was here, I could remember how to live again. I did not expect to fall in love with you, but I have, and I do not know how to tell you that without words." Grace stared at the page, then at Silas. He was watching her with an expression she had seen before but had not understood. Hope, fear, vulnerability. "You do not need words," she said. "You have been telling me for weeks. Every time you make sure I am warm. Every time you teach me something new. Every time you sit and listen to me read. Every time you look at me like I am the reason you remember how to smile." She paused. "I love you too. I did not expect to. I married you because I had no choice. But I am staying because I choose you. Every day, I choose you." Silas stood. He crossed the room and knelt in front of her chair. He took both her hands. He pressed them to his chest so she could feel his heartbeat. Then he leaned forward and kissed her, gentle, careful, like he was afraid she might disappear. She kissed him back, and she did not disappear. They were married again in April, not because they had to, but because they wanted to. Dr. Gaines came from Laramie with a preacher and witnessed a ceremony that meant everything the first one had not. Grace wore the same dress, but it fit better because she had taken the time to alter it properly. Silas wore a clean shirt and his best hat. They said vows in front of the house with the mountains behind them and the creek running fast with snowmelt. The preacher asked Grace if she took this man. She said yes, and meant it. He asked Silas. Silas nodded, and everyone there understood what that nod meant. They stayed in the mountains. Grace planted a garden. She learned to preserve vegetables and smoke meat and make soap. She learned to read the weather and the animals and the way the wind sounded when snow was coming. She learned to be the kind of woman who could survive a Wyoming winter with a man who could not speak but said everything that mattered. Silas built an addition onto the house. 2 rooms, one for storage, one left empty. In October, Grace told him she was pregnant. She did not use words. She simply took his hand and placed it on her belly. He stared at her. Then he looked at her stomach, then back at her face. She nodded. He dropped to his knees and cried. She knelt with him and held him while he shook with joy and terror and something close to prayer. The baby was born in May, a girl. They named her Catherine Rose. She had Grace's dark hair and Silas's gray eyes. Silas carved her a cradle, a new one, smaller and simpler than the one he had locked away. He rocked her every night. He sang to her without sound, just breath and rhythm and love. When Catherine Rose was 2 months old, Grace found Silas in the locked room. He was taking down the shelves, packing the small clothes into a trunk, taking apart the old cradle. "What are you doing?" she asked. He wrote in his notebook, "Making room." This was a room for grief. I want it to be something else now, a room for living. "What will you do with her things?" "Keep them, but not here, in the attic, so our daughter can see them someday and know she had an aunt who was loved. But this room should not be locked anymore. Nothing should be locked anymore." Grace helped him. They emptied the room together. Then Silas painted the walls white. He built new shelves. He made it into a room for their daughter to grow into. A playroom, a place for toys and books and light. The locked door stayed open. Years later, when Catherine Rose was old enough to ask, Grace told her the story, about the dawn wedding, about the locked room, about the man who could not speak, but learned to say everything that mattered without words. "Were you afraid?" Catherine Rose asked. "Terrified," Grace said. "I was forced to marry a stranger and live in the mountains with a locked door between us. I thought I had made a terrible mistake." "But you did not." "No, I did not. Because sometimes the things that scare us most are the things we need most. I needed someone who would let me choose. Your father gave me that. And he needed someone who would listen to him even when he could not speak. I gave him that. We saved each other. By opening the locked door. By being brave enough to look at what was behind it. By letting grief out instead of locking it away. By choosing each other every day, even when we did not have to." Catherine Rose grew up in that house. She learned to read from her mother and to carve from her father. She grew up knowing that silence was not the same as absence, that scars told stories, that locked doors could be opened if you were brave enough to turn the key. And when she was old enough, Grace showed her the letter Catherine had written to Silas, the one that said, "Let someone else love you too." Catherine Rose read it and understood that her name was not just a name, it was a promise. It was her father choosing to live again. It was her mother choosing to stay. It was a locked door opened and grief turned into hope. Some marriages start at dawn because they have to, because the world does not give you choices, only corners. But some marriages that start in corners end in light, not because the corners disappear, but because 2 people decide that the corner is where they will build something worth keeping. Grace had been forced to marry a mute mountain man at dawn, but what she found in his locked room did not stop her cold with fear. It stopped her cold with understanding. She found grief. She found loss. She found a man who had loved deeply and lost everything, and was terrified to love again. And she found that she could love him anyway. Not despite the scars, not despite the silence, not despite the locked door, but because all of those things had made him into someone who understood that love was not about words. It was about choosing to stay when you could leave, about opening doors you had locked, about letting someone see the worst parts of you and trusting they would not run. Silas never spoke again, but he did not need to. Grace heard him every day for the rest of their lives. In the way he touched her hand, in the way he looked at their daughter, in the way he carved small wooden birds and left them for Grace to find, like love letters written in cedar. And that was enough. That was more than enough. That was everything.